Doing craft fairs has to be one of my favorite things in the world. It's really funny talking to other artists and makers who say that they don't like doing them, or that they're too much work, or that they don't want to do them. Because to me, it gives me a lot of energy about my business and about what I'm doing, and just a lot of gratification. It feels good to be recognized for what I'm doing. With that said, I am an introvert. These shows absolutely just destroy my energy. I will be so exhausted after, but I still think it's so worth it. And I think they're so fun, but I will need a few days to recoup socially after. So let's dive in. First of all, my name is Julia. I'm a jeweler based in Asheville, North Carolina. I have done a lot of craft fairs around the US and look to continue to do more. I've spent hours on YouTube watching other people who do craft fairs and things like that, just to pick their brains and, get to know their knowledge. Same with TikTok and Instagram. I pretty much eat, sleep, and breathe craft fairs. It's something I'm super passionate about, and I hope that what I've learned along the way can be helpful to you. Also, just a note about today's video, I'm stuck at home with a sprained ankle and I have not been able to get in and out of the shower. Therefore, I am just going to be showing B-roll today because for everyone's sake, that is for the best. So feel free if you want to just pop in some headphones or put this on speaker and play it kind of podcast style, feel free to do that and maybe you can make a craft along with me. There's a lot of topics that we can talk about leading up to craft fairs. I want this to be kind of a general FAQ type situation. One of the many things that you're asking is how should I set up my booth? Now, if you've been on TikTok at all, you've probably heard about the Z formation booth. This is a really great setup for a lot of people for a lot of reasons, but this may not work for you. If you're not familiar with the Z formation booth setup, it's when you take three tables, you put one at the very front of your tent, say that you have a 10 by 10 tent, you have one table facing outward at the very front, so it's almost like a wall. The next one will be connected at the side, kind of going straight through the middle of your tent, facing backward, facing like back and forth, if that makes sense. And then the third one will be connected to the end of that table, going the other way once again in the form of a Z shape. That's the best way that I can describe it. The whole concept behind that is you want people to feel like they can access your booth without having to go in. Because once you go in, I think a lot of people have that mindset of, oh, now I feel like I'm obligated to buy something. Even though, as the vendor at the fair, people are not obligated to buy anything, and it's cool that they're even just looking, people will decide not to enter your booth if they feel like it's transactional and they have to make a decision while they're in there. So, this Z formation allows people to see things up front, see maybe some of your most eye catching products up front, but then also go deeper into your booth once they've established that they have interest. That's really helpful because then people don't have to decide up front before they even see your items. But I do think that it has a few flaws. The biggest one that I would consider would be if you are sharing a booth. Sharing a booth is something very common for larger craft fairs, more expensive craft fairs. Also, that's a great setup for outdoor markets, but for indoor markets, you may have a much different space that you're working with. If you're using a standard 10 by 10 tent, I think that that's an excellent way to do it. I don't see any issues with the Z formation setup, and that sounds like a great plan for you and maybe a really good starting point. However, if you are sharing, then you're going to run into some struggles of how can you make your booth accessible, but also have enough space to show your product, and if you're sharing, have enough space for your booth mate to share your product. I actually ran into this issue recently at Renegade in Chicago. I had the sweetest booth mate, Studio FSR, you should check out. They make candles and music to go along with the candles and scents and, perfumes, things like that. It's just so cool. But on day one with the setup, I thought it was actually a great idea that we both had our booths in an L shape. However, mine was going into the booth, so you'd have to walk into the booth to see my things. Well, theirs was going kind of on the outer edge of the booth. It almost was like think of like a S without the tail at one end, but their traffic kind of bottlenecked into my booth, which no fault of theirs at all. But if somebody was looking at their items because theirs were very appealing and they had a fantastic setup on day one, then my booth would have a lot of backs to it. This did happen once before at Renegade, also in Chicago, but that was different for a few reasons, which I'll dive into in a moment. But I'll even put in here the mock-up of like what our setup was because I think it's important to visualize what was going on here because the flow of traffic could not work well for me. So day one, I made $85 in sales. That was one pair of earrings. That was a very inexpensive pair of earrings compared to the other things I sell. So that was pretty heartbreaking, and I was really pessimistic about the rest of the weekend after that. Thankfully, day two came around, and I was thinking overnight about how I could rearrange my side of the tent without bothering my booth mate because I wanted to stick to our agreement of how we were going to set up and not be difficult. But I also was contemplating how can I make it better. I decided to switch around my bookshelf and my table, thinking that I could make kind of a packing station and set my table just a little bit closer to people. Thankfully, my boothmate also decided, after running out of a lot of product, to also change up their setup, which worked really well for me and helped so much on day two for foot traffic. I think that this setup was a really great option for both of us to have something that felt accessible to people. Now, this does still have the issue of people needing to walk into the booth. I will also say, just from what I noticed, I do think that my boothmate had a slower day on day two, given that there wasn't that stuff immediately up front for people to see, especially when you're picking up candles and things like that. People want to very quickly smell them and hold them, and they may not want to walk all the way into the booth to do that. Going back to my other renegade craft in Chicago, I shared with a boothmate who was absolutely incredible, Kelly from Soldered Curves, and I was actually really happy with that booth setup, as funny as it sounds, because it was almost identical to my day one setup at the market I was just discussing. However, Kelly also just had one table against the wall at their side of the booth, and it was very open and wide. Kelly's booth also drew in so much traffic, and I was so excited about that. I actually had a lady come up to me, and it stuck with me all weekend because she said, "Wow, you had such a horrible placement, didn't you?" Thinking that Kelly's traffic was hindering my traffic. However, I actually think that Kelly's traffic was helping my traffic. And the difference between this first Renegade in Chicago and the second one is that there was more space. So when people were looking at her stuff and shopping and were kind of in the way of my booth, they also had enough room to turn around and really look at what I had going on, even when the booth was jam packed. If anything, it even made some people stay stuck in the booth to look at my stuff for a little bit longer and get people interested in what I was doing. I do think in general, this is a huge benefit of sharing a booth. I will always be pro sharing a booth. If you know anything about me and my values in the craft world, I think that the more we can help each other, the better. I loved being with Frederick from Studio FSR, and I do think actually in some ways that his booth did help my booth to get more traffic. I do just think that the setup was a little bit on the tight side and made it a bit difficult for that to happen. However, like I said, when I was with Kelly, it was really nice that Soldered Curves is a bit on the edgy, fun side of what they have at Renegade Craft because I also feel like my jewelry is a bit on the edgy side. Soldered Curves make stained glass butts that you can hang in your window or in your house somewhere, and they're just so cute and iconic and amazing. When I saw that Kelly was my booth mate, I was so stoked. I was like, this is the perfect person to be put with because I knew their stuff was super cool and we were just gonna have good vibes together and that, our products were going to complement each other in some way. However, going back to my recent show in Chicago, while I do love Studio FSR's products, I did feel like our two vibes, our two aesthetics were very opposite. Studio FSR has a very clean, polished, sleek aesthetic, where Overdraft is a lot more edgy and grungy and rough around the edges. I don't think that that's too much of an issue, but I do feel like it was clear a lot of the time who were their clients and who were my clients or my, traffic, people that were coming to look at my table versus Studio FSR. And I think that's totally fine. I think that there is really something for everyone at Renegade, but I do think that when you happen to get put with somebody whose style and aesthetic matches yours very well, it creates a whole experience inside of your booth that people want to stay and shop for. There were a few crossovers of people who bought both mine and Soldered Curves products, but that didn't happen at Renegade the second time. Let's talk a little bit about indoor setups now. Indoor setups, it's very likely that you may have a smaller space, but the benefit is that it's a lot easier potentially for you to have a fully front facing setup. A lot of people will just use a table that faces the front. I had an 8 foot wide space that was 4 feet deep. I found that the perfect setup for me was to set up my tables still in an L shape. They're 4 foot tables, so I had one table facing the front, plus 2 feet of another table, which is the side of it, facing the front, which then connected to the wall. I also have a 2 foot bookshelf, and that was on the side of the long table. And so that created a full 8 foot display on the front of my booth. It also filled in the full back length of my display. However, that gave me room for a packing station, which is something that I have grown to love so much, is having room just to put your things, to get organized, to feel prepared when people make a purchase. I felt like a lot of times at fairs before that, I was really struggling when people would make a purchase and I'd be dropping bags and boxes and everything's kind of all over the place and boom, my table has now become a mess because I'm busy packing something and it really hinders the shopping experience for people coming along. I found that when I have a little extra room for packing, it helps to let other people continue shopping and looking at my products while I can kindly ask somebody to either continue looking around or just give me a moment while I pack up their item. I also want to talk about behind your table. This is something that took me way too long to learn. I would like to preface this with the fact that I have been doing markets well before I was in the craft world specifically. I used to sell vintage clothing and I always had this problem, and it took me way too long to figure out. At craft fairs or markets or whatever you're doing, you are going to have trash. You're going to have junk. You're going to have empty boxes. You're going to have things that are everywhere that don't have a home. So, underneath my table, I really like to make sure that I have organized boxes. One that has all of my packing materials in it and is kind of ready to go, is probably open at the top. Under that, I will store anything that's not in use in a zippered bag, almost like an IKEA bag or something like that. Anything that's not in use, whether that's packaging like bubble wrap for my displays or just like spare boxes or things that I don't need, I want that to be zipped up and put away out of my eyesight because otherwise it becomes very stressful behind the booth. Then lastly, always have a trash bag. I almost always forget a trash bag, but at some point or another, I will acquire a bag while being at the market. For example, at my last show, I DoorDashed some kava for lunch to my booth, and I used the kava bag, which was like this really nice large bag with handles, and that was my designated trash bag, which worked out so well because we had a hot sauce tasting booth near us, and everyone had little hot sauce containers that they wanted to throw away. I was happy to be able to provide that service for them, and they felt maybe a bit more engaged with me, even though it was such a small little thing to offer. It's like, "Oh, yeah, I can toss that for you." But I also feel like that just helps keep me organized, and the way that the vibe is behind the booth really affects my ability to perform at these markets. When everything is organized and in its place, I feel ready for anything. I feel ready to take on a sale. I'm prepared to pack and get their item ready and just have a good experience for the person. I often before that felt like I would fumble around a lot and I would be kind of all over the place looking for this and that. Now I'm very organized in that even my chair, there is a pocket on the side where I will keep any scissors that I have. I will also keep my pens in there, both black pen and then also a silver pen, which I use for my price tags because somehow, some way, my price tags will go missing. I think they just fall off from time to time, and I will need to rewrite them and put them back out. So that's really great to have. And then in the pocket of that chair, I keep a little sheet that tracks all of my orders. It's technically a booklet for taking in an order, which I bought it with the intentions of if somebody wants to pre-order, I can fill out the info on there, I can have them pay a deposit, I can give them a receipt. It has a little yellow paper behind it that will transfer your writing onto it so you can give them a copy. But I also use that book at this point to track my sales for the weekend just because it's something I have available to me and I can stick it right in that pocket of my chair and I'll have it right where I know where it is. I think things like that are just so useful. Being organized behind your booth is just a game changer. You're going to feel feel a lot more sharp. You're going to feel ready for anything. Having a mess behind there only makes it way worse when you have to go clean up at the end of the weekend or the end of the night if it's a one-day event. Talking about outdoor fairs, I would also like to talk about tents for your setup. A tent is so critical. If you don't have a tent, first of all, you're going to look a little out of place, in my opinion. It's going to feel a little bit empty and a little bit like you may have been unprepared. I've had a lot of experiences with tents through jobs and my previous vintage clothing business and craft fairs, using other people's tents, using my tents, buying tents, selling tents. I've done it all. And I will tell you, not all tents are created equal. I would really, really do your research to find a tent that's going to work well for you and it's going to last the test of time. Right now, I'm using a cheap, horrible Walmart tent that seems to want to buckle at the most important parts almost every time that there's a gust of wind. And I would not recommend that. I got that tent in a pinch. It was very last minute. I didn't have time to get one online. I used to have this fantastic green tent that I bought from eBay that had such a great locking mechanism. It was so easy to put up with one person. And same with taking it down. It was very robust. It was definitely a very heavy tent, but it was one that I could tell would last forever. If I wasn't moving states and moving into an RV, I would have kept that tent, and I still to this day miss that tent dearly. I will say the only downside of that tent is that the top of it was green. It was totally fine for clothing and my use. In the craft world, it's very important to have a white tent. Otherwise, the sun coming through can affect the color of your work. With jewelry, that may not be quite as important, mostly because I only work in silver and I don't use gemstones, but I do want to be considerate that I'm often sharing booths. In general, it does just look a bit more professional to have that white tent. Next, on your tent, you need to be considerate of your weights. I have weights that are empty bags that you fill with either water or sand. I bought those because I thought that would be an easy way to pack up something that folds up really small and tiny if I need to fit it into a suitcase, for example, if I'm flying. Realistically, though, I have driven to every single fair so far and I have not flown. So, with that said, it's actually created so much more work for me to have these bags that I have to fill and empty every single time. They seem great in concept, but you have to fill 4 bags with 40 pounds of water each. That takes so long using a sink. Also, being at an Airbnb that you're not familiar with, you don't know how easy it's going to be to lug around those bags once you finish filling them. My last Airbnb was fantastic, but it just so happened that I had to climb stairs to get into the Airbnb and then climb stairs downstairs to get to the sink and then go back up those stairs to bring them to the main level and back down another flight of stairs to bring my items outside. So doing that with 4 40-pound bags of water was a serious workout. I also had to do that at 6 AM when there were other people in the house who were sleeping, and I was trying to be so quiet even though I was exhausted and definitely not doing the best job of being quiet. I think that the little 40-pound disc weights that you can just slide right on probably are the most compact and convenient for travel. They are impressively small considering how heavy they are, and if you're able to just stick them in your car and forget them until you get to the market, I think that's just so much better. I do think if you're flying though, the water weights are a fantastic option. The other reason I got them is because, like I said earlier, I live in an RV, I have very limited space, so it is nice that I could roll these up and they are just so small when I'm not using them. Something you'll hear a lot of people talk about with outdoor markets is the weather. The weather is your friend and your enemy, but mostly it's your enemy. This most recent Renegade I did had the most perfect weather of all time. It was about 60 to 65 degrees in the daytime. In the night, it was cooling down to like the high 40s, low 50s. There was very little wind, but just a nice little breeze. And it was sunny, but with a little bit of cloud coverage all weekend. And it was just the most beautiful weather. That is not always going to be the case. I have fought extreme wind, rain, whatever it is, I have fought it all, and it is not fun doing outdoor events with that, especially when you're driving potentially across the country to do these markets. You absolutely should do your research onto what weather looks like that time of year, and also prepare yourself mentally for the fact that you may not be able to do this market if the weather doesn't allow you to do so. I had one market that was so windy where I learned my lesson about weights for the first time and my tent blew onto the other vendors. That was so traumatic. That was back in my vintage clothing days. I learned such a big lesson that day that even zip tying my clothing racks to the tent did not help. If anything, that made it more of a hazard when it went flying. I would not recommend that. Definitely consider your weights. Also, consider your displays within your tent. I recently had another very windy one at my studio. I have these necklace displays that are just wood held by little slots, and those things were getting blown around like crazy in the wind to the point where I had to take them down and just lay my necklaces flat on the table. I also did a show in Nashville that was about 95 degrees and so humid, and I felt horrible. I felt like I was going to be sick the whole time. I was so thankful that I happened to have a barbecue just before that and still had a cooler that I had full of ice that I could take with me. That cooler was the only thing keeping me sane. I genuinely was dipping my hands and my feet, as gross as that sounds, I was dipping my hands and my feet in the cooler. I was pouring ice down my shirt. I was so hot that like I didn't even know what to do or how I could load out of the market. I was there totally alone. I had no assistance. I was just stuck there for hours in the burning heat. So please consider the weather when you're preparing for a market, but at the end of the day, also remember that it's out of your control. And that if the weather dictates how your market weekend goes, that's not a reflection of you or your business, but it is good to be prepared by having things like ice or making sure you have sidewalls that are waterproof and a top that's waterproof to fight against rain, making sure you have the best weights possible, both for your tent but also for your displays, or having heavy displays or something like that. Having things that will just make your life a lot easier when weather decides to do its thing. Because it will, and it sucks, and we all hate it when that happens, but that's the unfortunate side of doing the outdoor markets. Indoor markets are fantastic, but you will struggle with foot traffic in a way that you won't at an outdoor market. Outdoor markets tend to just have people walking by and finding what's going on, where indoor markets are something that people need to know about. That's why I do prefer to do large markets that are very well recognized, such as the Big Crafty, Renegade Craft, Porter Fleet, things like that. Indie Craft Parade is fantastic. I know West Coast Craft is great. I haven't done it myself, but markets like that that really promote themselves and have a strong marketing team are going to be the ones that may be a lot more successful indoors. I definitely stray away from small markets that aren't well known in the community, especially if they're new. If they're new markets, it's going to be a struggle to get people in the door the first time. I know that they need to build that up. And while that may be worth it for some people, it's unfortunately not worth it for my business, especially if I have to travel far for that. Another thing I try to think about at markets is my booth placement. I will never pay for a better booth placement, and I will remind myself that no matter where I'm placed, that does not dictate my weekend. I know a lot of vendors will get really down on themselves if they get what they consider to be a bad booth placement, but just remember that you're in the same building as really talented people, and there's other ways that you can still get traffic to your booth. One thing I love to do at markets is hand out free stickers to people that has my business name, and they also have a witty comment. It says, "Shit, I overdrafted out the craft fair." People love those. I hand them out to vendors before the show starts, and I'll hand them out throughout the day to anyone who walks by. I think little things like that that you can use to promote your booth, even if you're not in the most ideal spot, are going to be helpful. If you're sitting there the whole time thinking about how you have a horrible placement and how the fate of this market is going to be bad because you are put in a bad spot, then you're going to create a bad weekend for yourself. No matter what your situation is at a market, try to be as optimistic as you can that it's going to work out well for you because that's going to be how you get the best results. People can tell when you're feeling down and you're not in it. I had a market where I found out that a friend passed away the second day of the market, and my sales the second day were not good, but that's because I was hardly hanging in there. And that was no fault of my own. I know that it was a situation, but I do know that that affected my sales. It's important to keep your head in the game when you can, but also understand that life happens and don't be too hard on yourself. If you found any of this information useful, please let me know below, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Also, I'd like to make more videos on this topic, so this is just my first dive into the idea of craft fairs and your actual setup at those craft fairs. I am going to plug my Discord channel, Chat Fair, which I created specifically for craft artists to find one another, to create community, to have a place where you can coordinate couch surfing, you can coordinate sharing an Airbnb, you can coordinate traveling together, you can coordinate sharing a booth, you can coordinate getting drinks after the show or food after the show or whatever you want to do, or just make friends from all around the world and have a lot of fun. That's totally free to join. I will put the link in the description. Please feel free to join. We are trying to grow this community because the bigger that the community grows, the better it's going to be as a resource for everyone. I believe in community. It's the number one thing that we have. One thing I love about the craft world in comparison to the more traditional art world I was in before is that it really is run by community. So let's keep that trend going. Let's create this resource by simply being there, even if you don't use it often. It's helpful to have another person just with other insights, and you can pop on once in a while and see what's going on. Hopefully, we can answer your questions about craft fairs, or at least provide you some insights, or provide you further information about your booth setup, or whatever kind of things you have going on in your mind coming up to a market, either the application or the market itself. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you watching my videos. I am very new to this, so I appreciate every single one of you, and that's all. Take care.